Start up. Hey everyone, welcome to the San Diego Supercomputer Center's series of lightning talks on wildfire management and technology. My name is John Porton. I am the Senior Research Manager for Research Programming in SDSC's SciCore division, where we're doing a lot of really exciting work on wildfire, including a tool called BurnPro 3D. And this is intended to help wildfire professionals plan and manage prescribed burns, which are purposeful burns of forest lands that will help prevent more disastrous spontaneous fires later. I'm privileged to be joined today by Chris Anthony. Chris is a fellow at the ProWESS Center, which is hosted by the SciCore division at SDSC. At the ProWESS Center, he's looking to connect innovative technologies to the wildfire community to help protect lives, communities, ensure resilient landscapes, and end the disastrous impact of wildfires. He helps us build relationships with the wildfire community and also create tools and technologies that wildfire professionals actually need and will use. Prior to joining SDSC, Chris worked as the Chief Deputy Director of CAL FIRE, where he oversaw fire protection, resource management, and support and administrative functions. He is the perfect person to help us understand the promises and limitations of new technological tools in wildfire management. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much for that introduction, John. It's really a pleasure to be able to be here today.
Yeah, we really appreciate your time. I think that the first thing I want to ask about, some of the people who are watching these talks may be real newcomers to understanding the policy ecosystem in which we talk about wildfires and wildfire management. So why don't you take a minute to tell us a bit about what CAL FIRE does and what your role at CAL FIRE was?
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. So I started my career with CAL FIRE in 1993. So I actually studied forestry at UC Berkeley and really had no intention of going into the fire service. CAL FIRE is the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. It is a state department within California that has jurisdictional authority for about 31 million acres of what we call state responsibility area lands. It's a large department. There's about 12,000 people in the department, and the department is in places all the way as far as Modoc and Siskiyou County, to the north, all the way down to San Diego County in the south. Um, so, as I mentioned, I started my career actually as a forester. I'm a registered professional forester with the state of California. But very early on in my career, I moved over into fire protection. And I began noticing a significant change in the way that wildfires were burning in our ecosystems throughout California around 2012. And although at the time I really couldn't articulate exactly what was causing those challenges, we could see that fires were getting a lot larger. And as an example, when I started my career, 60 or 70,000 acre fire in California was a big fire, and now we're in a place where single ignition fires are burning up to 1 million acres, like we saw on the Dixie Fire in Butte County. And so there's been a significant shift in the way that high severity fires are burning through the landscape, which is why the work at UC San Diego and the ProWESS Center and innovative tools like BurnPro 3D are so critical, so that we can get more low and moderate severity fire out on the landscape in these fire adapted ecosystems. So with CAL FIRE, we definitely had a significant, and still do have a significant, mandate to get more good fire on the ground. And um, and uh,
Did we freeze a bit there?
we did. I lost you for just a second. There we go.
You were talking about getting more good fire on the ground.
Yes, my apologies. So uh, So ultimately, many of the ecosystems in California are fire adapted. And what that means is that in some parts of the state, especially in our forested ecosystems, the fire return interval in those systems could have been anywhere between 3 or 20 years where naturally recurring fire was happening in those ecosystems. But we did such a good job of putting those fires out over the last 100 years that there's been a tremendous amount of fuels that have accumulated in those ecosystems. and they're essentially fire starved. And the density of fuels in those ecosystems is much, much higher than it ever has been. And when you couple that with a changing climate where we're having hotter, drier conditions, that's essentially one of the major reasons why you're seeing these large and damaging fires burning throughout the state of California. But there's a painful duality with fire. Um, uh, we actually need more of it on the landscape. We just don't need it at the severity levels that we're currently seeing it. And again, that's where tools like Burn Pro 3D come in to help us be able to better understand what's going to happen before we actually put planned ignitions out on the landscape.
We've really given ourselves quite a needle to thread, it sounds like, in that way. We need the fire, but it's got to be the kind of fire that isn't hurting communities or I suppose wildlife as well.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, and I'm glad that you brought up wildlife. So when it comes to the impacts of these large and damaging and high severity fires, we know that it has an impact on watersheds. We know it has impact on the ecosystems. We know it's changing many of our forest ecosystems into a different vegetation type because there isn't a seed source remaining in many of these areas after the fires burn through the forested lands. But in addition to that, it has a massive impact on the wildlife that are in those areas where these fires, rapidly spread um, through landscapes. And then in addition to that, obviously, it has a massive impact on the communities. And certainly San Diego County has had their fair share of large and damaging fires. And then the downstream economic impacts both at the local, state, and the federal level, are just massive, easily measuring into the hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah, I have to admit, when you started us off at 60 to 70,000 acre fires being big, and I knew you were going to leap to a larger number, I was even pretty shocked to hear 1 million acres. It's hard to wrap my mind around how big that fire is and how, the epicenter or the center of the burn of that fire is going to be so far from the resources that would allow that forest to recover. It really is kind of mind-boggling.
It is, and the challenge now is that even though California had been the epicenter of many of these large and damaging fires, we had the Smokehouse Creek fire in Texas, which was also 1 million acres. We had the Lahaina fire in Maui, which wasn't a big fire, but killed 102 people very, very quickly. And so it's no longer a California problem or even a Western states problem. It is absolutely a global problem now. And many of the factors that are a result of that are similar to what we see in California as well.
That makes sense. As much as we might take an entire hour to talk about how an earlier response would have been better, we are starting to see some shifts at both the state and federal level in terms of thinking about wildfire management. Can you talk about how some of that attitudinal shift has maybe affected policy or the goals that California has as a state?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been a lot of different legislative pathways that have been put into place over the last several years, understanding that we actually need to get more good fire out on the landscape. And so there's simple things like moving from a simple negligence standard for burners that have lost fires to a gross negligence standard, which provides protection to burners when they're going out and deploying fire in a prescribed fire application. Also, we're seeing much more cultural burning happening now and pathways being opened up for the indigenous communities throughout California to be able to put more cultural fire on the ground because they were, the stewards of these lands in California for thousands of years, and it's very important for them to have that opportunity to be able to get their cultural practices out on these landscapes also. And then in addition to that, there's also liability funds that are being set up. So we have prescribed fire liability funds that are established so that burners have some guarantee or insurance that, if something does go wrong, there's a way to be able to pay for any potential costs associated with the suppression of those fires.
I want to talk about that in a little more detail. I think I was an attorney in a past life, and I have a fairly good understanding of the gross versus simple negligence standard. But when you're talking about the guys who are on the ground setting and managing these fires, What does a simple to gross negligence standard mean? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so previously, if someone had lost a prescribed burn, it was uh, automatically assumed to be negligence, and therefore that person could be civilly liable for any costs associated with that fire. When you move to the gross negligence standard, and you have mechanisms in place for a burner who has burning under the right conditions. They have a burn plan. They're burning within the prescription of that burn plan. They have all the resources there that they said that they would have there. That they have all their permits in place. If they're doing everything right and they have gone through the process and they have a plan and it's been approved, and if in the event that fire escapes their control, they are now under the gross negligence standard and therefore have much more protections under the law as a result of that. It doesn't immune them from everything, but it certainly provides additional layer of protection.
Yeah, they're out there doing a complicated and dangerous job that creates a public good, and the current standard makes them, it's very easy to establish individual liability against these people. And so I suppose there's a how do you get people to burn under those circumstances problem.
Correct. Yes, absolutely.
One other shift that I've been reading about has to do with the Biden administration's plan to burn a bunch of extra acres over the course of the next however many years. Is that something? Are you seeing an increase in the demand for prescribed burns as well?
Yeah, so there's no one agency or entity can do it alone. And so whether it's CAL FIRE or the Forest Service or prescribed burn associations, um, we need as many trained people as we can possibly get in this space to safely deploy more prescribed fire on the landscape. And that's where tools actually like BurnPro 3D come into play. And I also mentioned the Nature Conservancy as well as a large
Okay.
national organization that's implementing a lot more fire. And what's really unique about BurnPro 3D is as a 3D fire modeling tool, where most of our fire models that we have available to us are two-dimensional and used more for initial attack fires. When you have a 3D fire modeling tool that's able to understand, um, what the vegetation is. You can use aerial LiDAR, you can use terrestrial LiDAR, you can use existing vegetation data sets, and then you can add in your weather conditions, your fuel moistures, um, and then you can also do a custom drip torch pattern, which is basically how the burner plans on implementing that burn on the landscape. Could be a drip torch, which is a tool that just drops little beads of fire to, set that fire, or it could be a helicopter that's dropping fire out of it to set that fire as well. When you have a better idea of what that fire is going to do before you actually put fire on the ground under a range of conditions, and you're able to model that in a three-dimensional environment and get outputs that are going to show you what the severity of that fire is, um, then you're much, much better prepared going into that burn. And when it comes to all of those people that need to come back into the prescribed fire space, because it is an art. And because we haven't been doing enough of it over the last several decades, we've lost a lot of experience. So when you have a model that can help a practitioner better understand what's going to happen before they put fire on the ground, what that does is that helps them not only better understand what's going to happen, but also gets them to yes much more easier. So there's a lot of barriers to getting prescribed fire on the ground, and one of them that we would like to try to overcome, especially with BurnPro 3D, is not understanding what's going to happen when the fire goes on the ground. And it's a planning tool and it's part of the planning process. Um, but if we look at scaling, we need to have these tools. It also helps on the safety side of the equation too, because we can see the thresholds or that outer envelope of a burn that certain conditions that you wouldn't want to burn in because it could be too high intensity, high severity. It could actually go over a planned line. And when you know what those thresholds are also in advance, then that also helps you better prepare for that burn as well. So it is really innovative to have 3D fire modeling, and it really is going to be a game changer, I believe, at a national level for getting more fire on the ground.
Outstanding. I have sort of two very similar follow-ups to that answer. And you've touched on both of them, but I think just getting you to go a little bit deeper would be useful. From the perspective of an individual planning a burn, the tool is obviously not a substitute for judgment. So what does that process look like when you have a tool like BurnPro 3D available to you?
Yeah, so there certainly is, in California, in order to deploy fire on the ground, you need to be a qualified burn boss under national standards, or you need to be qualified under the California Prescribed Fire Burn Boss program. And then other agencies like CAL FIRE have internal training as well for prescribed fire incident commanders. So there is a training process that is put into place for every person that's going to be responsible for implementing a burn in California, and that training is absolutely critical, which involves going out as a trainee on prescribed fires so that you know the process, you understand how to do burn planning development, you understand the environment that you're working in, and also the safety considerations that need to be put into place prior to deploying good fire. But also as part of that process, there are current models that are being used by these practitioners to model what that fire is going to do. And um, in comparison to BurnPro 3D, you realize that those models are actually fairly uh, inefficient and ineffective compared to what they'll be able to do with a program like BurnPro 3D. And right now, BurnPro 3D is in a beta testing phase, and so we're deploying it with CAL FIRE in the southern region of the state, and primarily in the Tuolumne Calaveras unit. And so we're getting it into the hands of practitioners so that they can tell us and give us feedback on the program, what they like, what they don't like, what they'd like to see changed, what works, what doesn't work. Because ultimately, this is a program that we want to curate and develop for this community, and not just for CAL FIRE, for any entity or agency that's going to be using it. We're also starting to do some work with the Nature Conservancy as well, and beginning to provide the product into their hands so that they can begin deploying it and understanding how it works. But ultimately, these programs are most informed and best informed by the practitioners that are using it. And one of the things that I think is really unique about UC San Diego is UC San Diego's ability to develop research and technology that becomes something that is applied in the fire space. And there's many examples of work that UC San Diego has done that is something that is used by firefighters in California on a daily basis now. And that's really hard to do. It's really hard to take something that is a research project or emerging technology and then translate that into hands of practitioners that use it every day. And that's one of the reasons why when I was originally approached by this project when I was with CAL FIRE, that it was such an easy yes, because this is something that UC San Diego is very, very good at and has a very high rate of success. And I think that this is just the evolution of that. Much of the work that UC San Diego has done prior to BurnPro 3D has been on the fire response side in the Wildfire lab. And with standing up the ProWESS Center and looking at proactive approaches so that we actually can drive down those large and damaging fires, is a really great segue into that proactive space where we can actually achieve wildfire resiliency in California.
That was really a high note to end on, but I have to ask one more question. From the perspective of an agency like CAL FIRE or the Nature Conservancy that's thinking about planning prescribed burns for a year or a season, how does a tool like BurnPro help them manage that problem?
Yeah, so generally when it comes to planned burns like prescribed fire, there is a long planning process that goes into place. And so uh, um, when you have a better idea of what that fire is going to do before you put fire on the ground, it can really inform the resources that you need to be able to safely implement that burn. And understanding that we don't have an unlimited amount of resources. And as we plan burns out ahead, whether it's in the spring, it's going to better inform the resource deployment that we need for each one of those fires. And ultimately, it will help us scale fire across the landscape, which is what we need to do. We need to stop going from 1 to 200 acre burns to 1,000 up to 10,000 acre good fire burns in California if we really want to scale. And so like tools like this just give much better informed decisions for practitioners. But then also just one last thing, it also helps inform the community about what's going to happen as well. And that's a really critical component. So if you have a 3D fire modeling tool and you can show the community how that fire is going to burn, what the smoke is going to do, um, uh, it gives them a better sense and really helps them better understand and greater sense of comfort on what's going to happen also because many people, see fire as this bad thing when in fact they're living in these ecosystems that fire was a natural part of for thousands of years before we moved into many of these wildland areas.
That's great. And I think that our conversation has really helped us understand the impact of getting Burn Pro 3D and similar tools as correct as we can. Thinking about very carefully what our inputs are, where we're gathering the data, how we're building these models, deploying them, building them in ways that firefighters will actually use them. And this context about how it affects fire management professionals around the country has been extremely useful. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, John. And yeah, really excited to see this moving forward at UC San Diego.
All right. For the rest of you watching, join us for the next in our series of lightning talks. We're going to talk more with firefighters on the ground about how they use the tool day to day. We're going to talk with people who collect the data to build these tools, and we're going to talk with the modelers themselves, all the different types of inputs that they need to make these tools function. Thank you so much, and we'll see you then.
Thank you.